February 1st, 1942. In the vastness of the Central Pacific Ocean, the USS Enterprise was in a desperate dash for survival. A mere 8 weeks after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor had left America's Pacific Fleet in ruins, the formidable Big E had retaliated, initiating the first offensive carrier raid of the conflict against Japanese installations in the Marshall Islands. Now, as it sped away at full throttle, 5 twin-engine Mitsubishi G-3M bombers hurtled towards it from an altitude of 10,000 feet. Every anti-aircraft weapon on the vessel unleashed a torrent of fire, their tracers illuminating the sky. 4 of the bombers released their munitions, all missing their mark, then veered off to return to base. However, the 5th bomber maintained its course. Lieutenant Kazuo Nikai's aircraft was already severely damaged. F-4F Wildcats had ravaged it during its approach, and smoke billowed from its fuselage. Nikai knew he couldn't make it back to base, so he made a decision that would not become common practice for another 2 years. He directed his flaming aircraft straight towards the Enterprise's flight deck. On the catwalk below, a 25-year-old aviation machinist named Bruno Gaido watched the bomber grow larger with every passing second. Every gun on the ship was firing, yet the aircraft kept closing in, now near enough for Gaido to see the flames licking from its engine cowling. The anti-aircraft defenses were failing. In approximately 10 seconds, that bomber would collide with the flight deck, and the Enterprise, America's most vital warship in the Pacific, would be engulfed in flames. Bruno Gaido performed the only act he could conceive. He ran, not away from the peril, but directly towards it. Gaido sprinted across the exposed flight deck, directly into the path of the incoming kamikaze, and clambered into the rear seat of a parked SBD Dauntless dive bomber. He seized the twin .30 caliber machine guns, aimed them at the approaching inferno, and opened fire. What ensued would become one of the most extraordinary displays of individual valor in naval aviation history. But Bruno Gaido's narrative was just beginning. Bruno was eager to enlist in the Navy without delay. Military service offered consistent wages, 3 meals a day, and something of greater value to a young man from a working-class background: purpose. Yet his father disapproved. John Gaido believed his son, at just 18, was too young. He had witnessed enough of the world to understand the profound impact military service could have on an individual, and wished Bruno to hold off. For 6 arduous years, Bruno drifted between various temporary jobs on farms and in a brewery, observing the news from Europe and Asia grow increasingly grim each month. Germany was rearming. Japan was on the offensive. By 1940, even his cautious father recognized that war was inevitable. That October, he finally relented, and Bruno enlisted in the Navy. Following basic training, Gaido was assigned to Naval Air Station Pearl Harbor on Ford Island, the nerve center of the Pacific Fleet's aviation operations. There, he began his training as an aviation machinist, learning to maintain the intricate engines that kept Navy aircraft aloft. In July 1941, he was temporarily attached to Scouting Squadron 6, which operated Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. This assignment was meant to be brief, just long enough to grasp the fundamentals of carrier aviation. However, Bruno Gaido possessed a knack for making himself invaluable. The Dauntless was a 2-seat aircraft. The pilot occupied the front, maneuvering the dive bomber during its near-vertical assaults on enemy vessels. The radio man gunner sat in the rear, managing the radio and operating the twin .30 caliber machine guns that provided rear defense against hostile fighters. As a machinist, Gaido's primary duty was to ensure the planes were operational, but he also qualified as a rear-seat gunner and quickly earned a reputation for a quality the Navy prized above almost all others: toughness. One particular incident became legendary among the Enterprise's air wing. In June 1941, a newly reported pilot named Lieutenant Norman Kleiss climbed into his SBD Dauntless to perform his inaugural carrier landing. This was among the most perilous maneuvers in naval aviation, attempting to bring down a weighty aircraft onto a pitching deck barely 800 feet long, catching one of the arresting wires with a tail hook while approaching at over 70 miles per hour. The standard procedure for carrier qualification flights was to fly solo, with sandbags in the rear seat to simulate the weight of a gunner. This way, if anything went awry, if the pilot missed the wires and went overboard, or crashed into the crash barrier, or spun off the deck, only one man would perish instead of two. When Kleiss entered his cockpit, he expected to find sandbags. Instead, he found Bruno Guido. Guido was already buckled in, manning the rear guns, with a slight grin on his face. "What the hell are you doing here?" Kleiss demanded. "This is my qual flight. Get out." Guido remained seated. "You've got wings, don't you?" he retorted. Kleiss attempted to argue, to explain the danger, to order Guido out of the aircraft. But Guido simply sat there, completely calm, utterly confident, awaiting the pilot to cease speaking and begin flying. Kleiss would later recount that Guido's assurance transformed his own state of mind. If this machinist believed in him enough to endanger his life on a qualification flight, then perhaps Kleiss could also believe in himself. He executed 6 flawless landings that day. Dusty Kleiss would later become one of the most decorated dive bomber pilots of World War II. He was the sole pilot to achieve direct hits on 3 distinct Japanese ships at the Battle of Midway, all of which were sunk. He was awarded the Navy Cross and lived to be 100 years old. Yet he never forgot the machinist who believed in him when it mattered most. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Bruno Guido was not stationed at Pearl Harbor. He was 200 miles away aboard the USS Enterprise, returning from a mission to deliver Marine fighter planes to Wake Island. The carrier had been slated to arrive in Pearl Harbor on December 6th, but severe weather had delayed its arrival by a single day. That delay saved the Enterprise and potentially altered the course of the war. When news of the attack reached the Big E, its aircraft were launched immediately in search of the Japanese fleet. They did not locate it. The 6 Japanese carriers had already vanished into the expansive Pacific, leaving behind the smoldering wreckage of Battleship Row. Enterprise scout planes arrived over Pearl Harbor during the attack itself, and several were shot down, some by Japanese Zeros, others by friendly fire from panicking American gunners who fired at anything in the sky. That evening, the Enterprise stealthily entered Pearl Harbor under the cover of darkness. Her crew witnessed the devastation wrought by the Japanese. The Arizona was still burning, the Oklahoma capsized. The fleet they had trained with for years reduced to contorted steel and shimmering oil. "Where in hell were you?" Angry voices called from the docks. "You'd better get the hell out of here before the Japs come back and nail you too." They refueled in the shadow of burning ships, working through the night, and by 0600 the following morning, the Enterprise had cleared the harbor channel and returned to the vast Pacific. It was December 9th, 1941. America was at war, and the Enterprise, one of only 3 operational carriers in the Pacific, was the vanguard of American power. The weeks following Pearl Harbor were brutal. One outpost after another, Wake, the Philippines, Hong Kong, much of Southeast Asia, fell to Japan in rapid succession. With the battleships decimated at Pearl Harbor, only a handful of carriers stood between Japan and the remainder of the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz understood that he couldn't reverse the entire war overnight, but he could retaliate, if only to demonstrate to America that it could still fight. On January 11, 1942, the Enterprise departed Pearl Harbor as part of Task Force 8, under the command of Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey, one of the most audacious naval commanders in American history. Their objective? the Marshall Islands, where Japan had established air and naval bases that imperiled American shipping lanes. Commander Thomas Jeter, the Enterprise's executive officer, concisely captured the crew's sentiment in the ship's daily plan. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This Sunday, it's our turn to shoot. The raid was slated for February 1st, 1942, a Sunday, just like Pearl Harbor. It would mark America's inaugural offensive action of the Pacific War. The raid on the Marshall Islands commenced before dawn. The Enterprise launched 36 SBD Dauntless dive bombers against Kwajalein, Wacha, and Maloelap atolls. The attacks caught the Japanese by surprise, annihilating aircraft on the ground, sinking ships in the harbors, and destroying shore installations. It was retaliation, small retaliation, but retaliation nonetheless. However, the Japanese struck back. At approximately 1:40 p.m., as the Enterprise withdrew from the area at high speed, 5 Mitsubishi G3M Nell bombers located her. They had launched from Roy Airfield on Kwajalein, tracking the American carrier through a combination of fortune and perseverance. The bombers approached from the starboard bow at 10,000 feet. The Enterprise's anti-aircraft batteries unleashed a barrage, creating a wall of steel. F-4F Wildcats from the Combat Air Patrol plunged towards the attackers. The Nells entered a shallow power dive, each releasing 3 bombs. Captain George Murray put the Enterprise through sharp maneuvers, and all 15 bombs missed, the closest splashing into the water about 50 feet off the port quarter. 4 of the bombers turned for home. The 5th did not. Lieutenant Kazuo Nikai's bomber was crippled. Wildcat fighters had riddled it during the approach, and flames were now clearly visible streaming from the engines. The plane was failing, and Nikai knew he would perish with it. So he made a choice. Instead of attempting to coax his disabled aircraft back to base, a journey he would never complete, Nikai sharply turned left and aimed his bomber directly at the Enterprise. This was something unprecedented. The term kamikaze would not be coined for another 2.5 years, when Japan would formalize suicide attacks as official policy. In the initial weeks of the conflict, Lieutenant Kazu Nakai independently reached a conclusion that would soon become ubiquitous among Japanese aviators. If death was inevitable, he would ensure a maximal toll of American lives. On the Enterprise, every available weapon unleashed fire, sending streaks of tracer rounds toward the incoming aircraft. Explosions peppered the sky around it, yet the Nell continued its descent, now engulfed in flames but still spewing bullets. The anti-aircraft barrage failed to halt its approach. From his post on the catwalk, a narrow platform skirting the flight deck, aviation machinist's mate 3rd Class Bruno Gaido watched the bomber loom larger. He had mere moments to react. Bruno Gaido's assigned combat station was the catwalk, not an airplane. His duty during battle was to remain protected, out of harm's way, awaiting the cessation of hostilities to resume his core task of maintaining the dive bombers. However, Bruno Gaido was never one to remain static. As the burning bomber bore down, Gaido executed an act that defied all rational logic. He emerged from the sheltered catwalk, sprinted across the exposed flight deck directly towards the advancing aircraft, and clambered into the rear cockpit of a stationary SBD Dauntless dive bomber. This was Aircraft 6S5, a Dauntless from Scouting Squadron 6, Gaido's usual position when the plane was airborne. Yet, at this moment, it was merely a parked aircraft, laden with aviation fuel and bombs, still secured under its wings. A direct hit from the Japanese bomber would inevitably cause its explosion. Gaido was aware of this, but it mattered not. He seized the twin .30 caliber machine guns, pivoted them towards the approaching bomber, and opened fire. From Admiral Halsey's vantage point on the bridge, the scene unfolded surreally. Amidst the pandemonium of anti-aircraft fire and evasive maneuvers, one individual had charged towards peril instead of away from it. Now, this man occupied the rear seat of a parked dive bomber, firing point-blank at a flaming Japanese aircraft on the verge of crashing into the vessel. Witnesses would later characterize it as a personal duel, the Japanese pilot and the American machinist exchanging fire in the final seconds before impact. Gaido depressed his guns, aiming directly into the cockpit of the low-flying bomber. Tracers poured from his weapons, piercing the glass and metal of Nakai's aircraft. At the decisive moment, Captain Murray ordered another sharp turn to starboard. The combined effect of the ship's maneuver and Gaido's relentless fire, riddling the cockpit, caused the bomber to lose control. Instead of smashing into the flight deck, the Nell's right wing grazed the tail of Gaido's SBD. The impact cleanly severed the tail, 3 feet from where Gaido still fired. The mangled Dauntless careened towards the edge of the flight deck. The Japanese bomber's wing detached from its fuselage and skidded onto the port catwalk, ruptured fuel tanks drenching the ship's forward section and the island's superstructure. Lieutenant Nakai's aircraft, its mission concluded, plunged into the sea off the Enterprise's port quarter and vanished beneath the waves. But Bruno Gaido was not finished. Still in the rear seat of his mangled aircraft, now perched precariously on the flight deck's edge, Gaido continued to fire into the bomber's wreckage as it sank. Then, with no remaining targets, he calmly retrieved the SBD's fire extinguisher and doused a pool of burning aviation fuel left on the deck by the Japanese plane. Only then did he exit the shattered aircraft, and subsequently, Bruno Gaido did something that, in hindsight, was entirely characteristic. He disappeared. As soon as the immediate danger passed, Bruno Gaido melted into the ship's interior, vanishing into the labyrinthine compartments and passageways of the Enterprise's lower decks. He sought no accolades. He was hiding. Gaido was convinced he faced severe repercussions. He had abandoned his assigned battle station, entered an aircraft without authorization, and acted precisely in a manner a good sailor was never supposed to, on his own initiative, without explicit orders from superiors. In the pre-war Navy, such actions carried the risk of court-martial. However, Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey was not a pre-war admiral. Halsey had observed the entire episode from the bridge. He'd witnessed the machinist sprint across the deck, climb into the parked aircraft, and unleash fire upon the approaching bomber. He'd seen the tail shear off 3 feet from Gaido's position. He'd watched the young man calmly extinguish the fire and then vanish into the ship. "Who was that man?" Halsey demanded. No one on the bridge knew. "Find him," Halsey commanded, "and bring him to me." A search party was dispatched throughout the ship. It took some time to locate Gaido, who had concealed himself effectively, but eventually they tracked him down and escorted him to the bridge. Gaido stood at attention before the admiral, convinced he was about to be disciplined. Instead, Halsey smiled. "Consider yourself promoted," the admiral declared on the spot. Without paperwork or formal ceremony, Bruno Gaido was advanced from Aviation Machinist's Mate 3rd Class to Aviation Machinist's Mate 1st Class, a promotion that typically required years of service and numerous evaluations. Halsey awarded it with a handshake. The entire crew of the Enterprise credited Gaido with saving the ship. Had that bomber struck the flight deck, laden with aircraft, fuel, and ammunition, the ensuing explosion and fire would have been catastrophic. The Big E might have been lost, and with her, hundreds of American lives. Bruno Gaido also received a commendation from Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, recognizing his extraordinary courage and disregard for personal safety. But Gaido, being Gaido, likely preferred to avoid all the attention. He simply wanted to resume his work. The months following the Marshall Islands raid proved busy for the Enterprise and its crew. In late February, the Big E attacked Wake Island, the same island where Marines had bravely fought before being overwhelmed by the Japanese. In March, it struck Marcus Island, merely 1,000 miles from Tokyo. In April, it provided cover for the Doolittle raid, escorting the USS Hornet close enough to Japan to launch 16 B-25 bombers against Tokyo itself. While these raids did not alter the strategic landscape, Japan was still victorious on every front. They demonstrated America's capacity to retaliate and elevated Bruno Gaido to a minor celebrity among the Enterprise crew. Everyone on the ship knew the tale of the machinist who had confronted the kamikaze. Yet Gaido remained unfazed by the attention. He continued his duties as a machinist and gunner, participating in missions whenever VS-6 required him. His reputation for tenacity only grew. Then came Midway. In late May 1942, American codebreakers deciphered Japan's next objective, a massive assault against the tiny Midway Atoll, employing the same 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. If Midway fell, Hawaii itself would be jeopardized. Admiral Nimitz decided to risk everything. He swiftly deployed the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown to a position northeast of Midway, hoping to ambush the Japanese fleet. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Bruno Gaido occupied the rear seat of an SBD Dauntless, piloted by Ensign Frank Woodrow O'Flaherty. Their target was the Japanese carrier Kaga, one of the world's largest and most formidable warships. The morning of June 4, 1942, began disastrously for the Americans. Wave after wave of American aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet. Torpedo bombers from all 3 carriers, Marine dive bombers from Midway itself, even Army B-17. Almost all were obliterated. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet was completely decimated. Only 1 of 30 men survived. However, the sacrifice of the torpedo bombers served a crucial purpose. Their attacks drew the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to sea level, leaving the skies above the carriers undefended. At 10:20 a.m., dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet at 20,000 feet. The Japanese carriers were caught at the most inopportune moment. Their flight decks swarmed with aircraft being fueled and armed for a counterattack. Bombs and torpedoes lay exposed, and aviation fuel lines snaked across the decks. The American pilots pushed their aircraft into their dives. Bruno Gaido felt the Dauntless pitch forward into a nearly vertical descent. The horizon tilted wildly as O'Flaherty aimed their aircraft at the Kaga below. Gaido couldn't see forward. He faced backward, scanning for Japanese fighters. But he could feel the immense gravity pressing him into his seat as they plummeted towards the enemy carrier. At 1,500 feet, O'Flaherty released their bomb. It narrowly missed. The bomb detonated close to the carrier, but failed to strike it directly. However, other pilots were not so unfortunate. 4 bombs impacted Kaga's flight deck, exploding among the armed and fueled aircraft. Within seconds, the carrier became an inferno. In just 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were mortally wounded, burning uncontrollably. The 4th, Hiryu, would be hit that afternoon. It was the most decisive naval victory in American history. But for Bruno Gaido, the battle was just beginning. After the attack on Kaga, O'Flaherty and Gaido joined a group of 6 SBDs led by Lieutenant Charles Ware, heading back towards the Enterprise. But they were not alone. 6 Japanese Zero fighters from Hiryu spotted the small formation and attacked. The Zeros had been escorting a dive bomber strike against the USS Yorktown, but they could not resist the temptation of 6 slow, vulnerable Dauntlesses. Lieutenant Ware had devised a defensive tactic for precisely this situation. As each Zero fighter initiated an attack run from the rear, Ware expertly maneuvered his formation to confront the aggressor, forming an arc that enabled all 6 tail gunners to focus their fire on the lead enemy aircraft. Bruno Gaido and his fellow gunners unleashed a torrent of bullets into the attacking Zeros. Two of the Japanese fighters sustained such severe damage that they were forced to disengage. One crash-landed en route back to the Hiyu, while the other barely managed to return to its carrier. However, the intense skirmish had taken a heavy toll on Flaherty and Gaido's aircraft. Their SBD Dauntless had been pierced either during the bombing run or the dogfight with the Zeros, and fuel was visibly gushing from the compromised tanks. The engine was consuming gasoline at an accelerated rate, leaving insufficient fuel to complete the journey back to the Enterprise. Faced with no alternative, Flaherty ditched the Dauntless in the open ocean approximately 20 miles from the burning Japanese carriers as the other SBDs continued homeward. The landing was successful. Flaherty and Gaido quickly extricated themselves from the sinking aircraft, inflated their life raft, and climbed aboard. James McCarthy, flying in another SBD, observed their actions, recorded their position, and then proceeded toward the Enterprise. Assistance was intended, but it never arrived. The Japanese destroyer Makigumo discovered them first. The Makigumo, a Yugumo-class destroyer, was part of the protective screen for the Japanese carriers. Earlier that morning, her crew had witnessed 3 of those carriers engulfed in flames and sink, and hundreds of their comrades perish in the conflagration. When lookouts spotted the 2 American airmen in their tiny raft amidst the debris field of the obliterated Japanese fleet, the Makigumo altered its course to rescue them. Ensign Franco Flaherty and aviation machinist's mate First Class Bruno Gaido became captives of the Imperial Japanese Navy. What transpired next remained concealed for 3 years. The Americans were unaware, as were their families. Flaherty and Gaido were merely listed as missing in action, one among thousands of such notations in the disarray of the Pacific War. It was not until after Japan's surrender in 1945 that American investigators gained access to Japanese naval records and unveiled the events that unfolded aboard the Makigumo. For 11 days, Flaherty and Gaido were detained on the Makigumo. According to Japanese records, they underwent rigorous interrogation. The Japanese sought comprehensive intelligence, the strength of the American carrier fleet, the disposition of ships, and the defensive capabilities of Midway Island. The Japanese asserted that Gaido furnished valuable information regarding Midway's defenses, though this claim was almost certainly unfounded. Bruno Gaido had never set foot on Midway Island. He was a carrier-based machinist and gunner, possessing no knowledge of the island's fortifications, troop numbers, or defensive strategies. Nor did Flaherty. Rear Admiral Samuel J. Cox, director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, later offered his assessment of what likely transpired. My assessment is that Flaherty and Gaido, possibly under torture, provided plausible but fabricated information. Indeed, everyone who knew Gaido steadfastly believed he would never have broken. This was Bruno Gaido, the man who had confronted a kamikaze, who had clambered into a stationary aircraft to engage in a confrontation with a suicide bomber. The man who had reassured a nervous pilot, "You got wings, don't you?" He was not one to yield. However, on June 15, 1942, 11 days after the Battle of Midway, the Japanese determined that their prisoners were no longer useful. Commander Isamu Fujita, the captain of the Makigumo, received orders to dispose of the prisoners. According to Japanese accounts compiled from post-war interrogations of surviving crew members, Fujita solicited volunteers to carry out the execution. The crew declined. Even after witnessing 3 carriers burn, even after the humiliation of Japan's inaugural significant defeat of the war, the sailors of the Makigumo would not willingly participate in the murder of 2 defenseless prisoners. No one stepped forward. The disposal was postponed. But later that night, in the early hours, a small group of men were ordered, not asked, but ordered, to execute the task. Ensign Franco Flaherty and aviation machinist mate first class Bruno Gaido were bound with ropes, weighted with fuel cans, and cast overboard into the Pacific Ocean. They perished by drowning in the darkness, somewhere within the vast waters where their dive bomber had played a part in destroying the pride of the Japanese Navy. Japanese narratives indicate that both men faced their end with stoic and dignified defiance. The crew of the Makigumo would have anticipated nothing less from Bruno Gaido. Bruno Gaido's fate remained unknown for 3 years. He was declared missing in action on July 4, 1942, and presumed dead on June 5, 1943, the first anniversary of Midway. In Milwaukee, his mother, Clementina, received the telegram every parent dreaded. Her son was missing. He might be alive. He might be dead. No one knew. She never recovered. Clementina Gaido passed away less than 2 months after Bruno was reported missing. The family later attributed her death to the profound stress of not knowing her son's fate. In April 1943, Bruno Gaido was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation read, "With heroic and meritorious devotion to duty, he rendered valuable assistance to his pilot by detailing continuous, specific, and comprehensive information concerning the disposition and movements of enemy Japanese units. His courage and cool determination in carrying out this vital task in the face of furious and repeated attacks were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service." It was not until after the war that the complete story came to light. American investigators, reviewing Japanese naval records and interrogating surviving crew members from the Makigumo, reconstructed the events surrounding Flaherty and Gaido. The execution was categorized as a war crime, but no prosecutions ensued. Commander Isamu Fujita and most of the officers responsible for the execution did not survive the war. The Makigumo herself was sunk on February 1, 1943, precisely 1 year to the day after Bruno Gaido had saved the Enterprise, when she struck a mine during the evacuation of Guadalcanal. A form of justice had been rendered. Bruno Peter Gaido was 26 years old at the time of his death. He served in the United States Navy for a mere 20 months, from October 1940 to June 1942. In that brief period, he participated in the first offensive operation of the Pacific War, protected America's most crucial aircraft carrier from a kamikaze assault, and contributed to the sinking of a Japanese carrier at the Battle of Midway. His remains were never retrieved. His name is etched on the Courts of the Missing at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, one of thousands representing those who sacrificed their lives in the Pacific and whose bodies were never found. In 1996, Bruno Gaido became the inaugural inductee into the Enlisted Combat Aircrew Roll of Honor, established aboard the USS Yorktown Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. No ship has ever been christened in his honor, yet his narrative endures. Dusty Cleese, the pilot who performed his initial carrier landings with Gaido in the rear seat, went on to become one of the most decorated aviators of the war. He scored hits on 3 Japanese ships at Midway, all of which subsequently sank, earning him the Navy Cross. He lived to the age of 100, passing away in 2016. Before his demise, Cleese authored a memoir titled "Never Call Me a Hero." In it, he dedicated several pages to Bruno Gaido, the machinist who believed in him when it mattered most. "You got wings, don't you?" That was Bruno Gaido, a young man from Milwaukee who aspired to serve his nation. A machinist who ensured the dive bombers remained operational. A gunner who confronted danger when others recoiled. He did not live to witness the war's conclusion. He did not live to see Japan's capitulation, nor the ensuing parades and celebrations. He perished in darkness, bound and weighted, cast into the very ocean where he had helped alter the course of history. Yet, In that singular moment on February 1st, 1942, when he emerged from safety and sprinted across the flight deck toward a burning kamikaze, Bruno Guido demonstrated the profound impact an individual can have when they choose to act. He salvaged a vessel. He preserved hundreds of lives. And he demonstrated that courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the act of confronting fear and leaping nonetheless.